The world of Dareth, or rather Island of Dareth. It's so easy to say that though, isn't it? From our perspective as players in Asheron's Call, Dareth is our entire world. But what a world it is, spanning a real-life equivalent of 25 by 25 kilometers. That is not a small space, but we know the world is actually quite a bit bigger than that. But of course, there's an underlying shadow that we don't often think about. I'm talking about our homeworlds, or specifically, the homeworld of the Isparians. Welcome to the Abyss, folks. My name is Void Money, and today we're going to take an overview look at the world of Ispar. Part 1. Geography. The first thing we should look at is the placement of land and people on Ispar, in order to have context about Isparians. First, we should know about the land they grew up in. Examining the map of Ispar from Crossroads of Dareth, a few things become readily apparent. Now, before I get too deep into this, it's worth noting that this is a fan-made map, but it's generally accepted by the fan community as an accurate representation based on in-game information. On the AC Fandom Wiki, there's annotated information regarding where all of these lands are in relation to one another. The first thing that needs mentioning is that, well, Ispar doesn't seem to be very large, does it? All in all, the scale of distance ranges from negative 100 kilometers to positive 150k, which means that Ispar is only 250 by 250 kilometers, just a single factor of 10 larger than Dareth. Now granted, as I mentioned earlier, this is a fan-made map. However, it is rooted off of in-game lore, and I wouldn't be too surprised if aspects of the geography were fed to the map's creator, Solitaire, from a source that can be tied back to Turbine at some point. Nonetheless, even if it isn't considered strictly canonical, the intellectual property has largely been abandoned and is now primarily maintained by fans. Yes, I understand that this may raise legal concerns, but at this juncture in the game's life cycle, it might not be of paramount importance. Unless the owners of the IP come to intervene and object, the actions and creations of fans in this space effectively shape the world's reality. And honestly, that's what Asheron's Call has been about since day one. Players have always had a say in the comings and goings of Dareth. You might even say the developers' abandonment of the franchise is a coincidental analogy to the Isparian abandonment of their homeworld. But let's not delve too deeply into philosophy. We're here to look at maps, so let's get going. Continuing on, if you notice the small size of Ispar, and its relative similarity to a certain part of our own world, the Mediterranean, it begs the question if Ispar is really even a world in its own right, or simply a region of the Isparian homeworld. Alternatively, it might be one of those cases in fiction where it serves as both, a distinct landmass on a planet and also the name of the planet itself, depending on the needs of the writers. Regardless, I like to envision Ispar as the ancient homeland of the Isparians, complete with the possibility of undiscovered continents or a northern land bridge connecting the peninsula to other parts of their world. Returning to the Mediterranean comparison for a few moments, you may also notice that there are several different geographical regions that roughly correspond to the Mediterranean analogs. Viamont seems to be an amalgamation of the Iberian Peninsula with other nations in southern Europe that border the Mediterranean. Silverin and Alluvia roughly correspond with Nordic and Germanic regions of Europe, while Melantos seems to be separated by a Black Sea analog and thus corresponds to Turkey and the western portion of the Middle East. In South Ispar, Garun and Rulia are comparative to northern Africa. As for show, it really doesn't fit. They're somewhat isolated, and their geography more closely resembles that of a mirror image of China, with Iowa possibly corresponding to Taiwan. Another region that doesn't neatly align with the Mediterranean analogy is the high steppes of Soyave, which seems more comparable to the Mongolian steppes of Asia. However, this doesn't pose a significant issue since it doesn't need to be a perfect analogy for the Mediterranean relation to hold. There is one other analogy I kind of want to make, however, and I do think it has some relevance, but it isn't perhaps a perfect analogy. That comparison is, of course, England. If we consider the Iron Sea as analogous to the Bristol Channel, and the unnamed sea north of Viamont as akin to the Cardigan Bay of Wales, it's not too far-fetched to envision this as the southern portion of Great Britain, with the great ice fields extending into what corresponds to Scotland. While I don't believe this analogy is as strong as emphasize the Mediterranean comparison, it's quite hard to deny that the shape of Ispar bears a closer resemblance to England than the Mediterranean. With that said, perhaps both real-world regions influenced the design of this map to some extent. The topographical features of the map, including deserts, mountains, and vegetation, are largely supported by in-game or event releases, all of which are available on the Ispar geography page of the fandom wiki. I'll also provide a link in the description if you'd like to read through it all. Unadventurer has taken it a step further, using satellite views and an antique weather-stained map. Both of these sources reveal the topography in greater detail. As a fan of maps, it's valuable to examine maps in different styles like these, as sometimes just a change in color palette can provide a better sense of the overall picture. In the newer maps, the coastline details have been sharpened, revealing finer features. Various fjords and peninsulas along the coastline become visible, details that were not discernible in the older map. In general, most of the playable races in the game are centered around the Iron Sea, which is bordered by Viamont to the west, Alluvia to the north, and Gurun to the south. The other two Iron Sea nations, Rulia and Melantos, which lie west and east of Gurun respectively, do not have any representation in the game. The two primary outliers are Sho and Silverin. Sho, of course, received representation as one of the 3 original character races. However, one can imagine that Silverin might have been intended as a future race. I am curious about how they would have made Silverins distinct from Alluvians if they had been added. Nevertheless, these two nations are situated at the southern and northern extremities of Ispar. I would further argue that the most significant landmass is the strip of land occupied by Rulia, Gurun, and Sho. With its considerable size, this region is expansive enough to accommodate 3 large nations, significant Isparian cultures, and multiple biomes. One might even imagine Melantos as being located in a fertile crescent, positioned between 2 rivers as depicted on Solitaire's map. It brings to mind the idea of Mesopotamia, nestled between the Tigris and Euphrates. Just a fun connection. They both start with M. Are you convinced yet? Anyway, I enjoy envisioning Silverin as a Scandinavian analog, and I'm certain that many fans were eagerly anticipating the opportunity to play as a Nordic counterpart. I must admit that I'm somewhat surprised they didn't proceed with a playable Silverin, especially considering the success of games like Skyrim, which capitalized on the Nordic fascination among fantasy game enthusiasts. I can easily picture other Asheron's Call fans imagining Silvera surrounded by fjords and rough seas, perhaps with longboats filled by barbarian warriors, venturing to invade more prosperous lands. The Viamontian Peninsula provided Viamontians with a natural buffer, being almost entirely surrounded by the sea, with the only land accessible being through the heavily wooded Alluvia. It's not difficult to imagine that with Viamont's easy and abundant access to the sea, campaigns anywhere on Ispar wouldn't be beyond the realm of possibility. This transition segues quite neatly into the next part of this video. Part 2. Isparian Geopolitics. On Ispar, there is one particularly belligerent state, one nation whose people by and large impose their will on others through the means of warfare. Can you guess which nation that is? That's right, it's Viamont. Much like on Dareth, the Viamontians of Ispar harbored grand ambitions of domination, seeking to supplant the previous imperial regimes before them. Consequently, Viamontian king Verici Corcosi, the father of our familiar tyrant Verici II, set his sights on Rulia and Alluvia. Alluvia would prove to be a challenging campaign for the Viamontians, but Rulia, on the other hand, quickly succumbed to the might of the Viamontian war machine. The Viamontians then turned their attention to Gurun, and that's where things took a sour turn. Although they initially achieved some victories, including the capture of the legendary city of Tirithas, which, aside from sounding like a Lord of the Rings city, was taken by the Gurundim for Rulia many ages ago. The situation changed with the continued siege of the city, however, as the Viamontians gained a foothold. The Gurun were bolstered by thousands of Sho and Suave mercenaries who came to defend Tirithas, shedding more light on Viamont as the global Isparian menace. The next major battle was waged at Shiriaz, where the Gurun managed to hold their ground. However, the Viamontians made a perplexing decision to withdraw, sending a significant portion of their troops back to Viamont. As it turns out, the Viamontians' most significant adversaries are often themselves. Events you may be familiar with, involving the Duke of Beleness and his daughter Eleonora, led to the slaying of Verici's youngest son, ultimately causing the Bellini faction and the pursuing forces of Verici II to escape through a portal. We all know what happened next. And if you don't, check out my Eleonora's Heart video. This leaves me with the question of what transpired in the current geopolitical landscape after the loss of the two major Viamontian forces on Ispar. Nonetheless, as it stands, Viamont remains the aggressor nation, expanding its imperial influence into the homelands of various peoples of Ispar. The Sage of Nishadina writes in the Origins and Current Dispositions of Viamont that the loss of both his youngest and eldest sons, along with the betrayal of his most trusted warlord, has resulted in Viamont putting a halt to its territorial advances. This, however, raises a significant question regarding the current geopolitical landscape in a land where a substantial portion of the population has mysteriously vanished through portals. Fans of The Leftovers might find some parallels here. How does a world move forward when many of its own inhabitants simply disappear without explanation? While on Dareth, people would be acutely aware of the developments on Ispar with each new arrival through portals. It's a one-way information exchange, and nobody on Ispar knows where these portals lead. Conceivably, this would result in something of a standstill on Ispar, mirroring what we observe with the cessation of war under Verici's rule. However, the machinations of the Korkosi clan did not occur in isolation. Earlier empires, such as the Rillian and Melantian, laid the groundwork for global dominance. The Rillians, for instance, were known for their claim over the Nakut Desert, even before the migration of the Gurun from their original homelands south of the desert, in the Nereid Mountains region. Additionally, they established the city of Lore, Terithus, which would later become a coveted prize in the conquests of both the Gurun and Viamontians. The Melantian Empire, meanwhile, was responsible for the complete eradication and genocide of the Kael-Aran people and the subjugation of the Suyave as blood slaves. The Melantian indeed appeared quite menacing during their prime, but their power began to wane around the time of the Gurun rise. It's worth noting, however, that some of the earliest heritage group lore in the game, dating all the way back to 1999, lists both Viamont and Melantos as potential aggressors against the Gurundim people. Furthermore, it explains that the Gurun and Melantians already had an established feud, with the founding of the Jaralim being a direct response to hostilities from the Melantian king, who was later assassinated by this very group. Given all of this, Gurun emerges as a potential power player that could rival the Viamontians. Positioned somewhat centrally on Ispar, their kingdom experienced growth and success, largely at the expense of the declining Rillian Empire. During their northward migration, they seized control of most of the Nakut Desert, and the capture of the city of Tirithus by the Gurundim marked the inception of their own empire. It's not beyond the realm of imagination to view Tirithus as a fantasy analog to the city of Alexandria, which was celebrated in antiquity for its legendary library and later remembered for its sacking by the Romans. Before the Viamontian invasion, Alluvia appeared to be a somewhat disorganized region, reminiscent of the early Celtic or Germanic societies that came together and unified in response to the threat of Roman conquest. Their role in current Isparian geopolitics isn't extensively documented, but it's clear that they were holding their own against the Viamontians prior to the arrival of portals to Dareth. As for Silverin, they don't appear to have much involvement in the events transpiring on Ispar. However, there might be a reason for this. There are rumors suggesting that various royals and nobles on Ispar entered into marriage pacts with the Silverin women. Notably, Eleonora de Beleness's mother is often cited as a source for these Silverin marriage connections. This raises the question of whether this decision in Beleness lore was made to possibly link Silverins into the broader narrative of the Viamontian royals as the antagonists against all the free peoples of Dareth. With the Bellini bloodline tied to Silveran nobility, it's not beyond the realm of imagination to consider that the Silverans might have formed alliances with the Duke of Beleness during the period of Viamontian infighting. This brings us to the Shou Nation, which is the last remaining nation I have yet to touch on. The fact of the matter is that the Shou don't appear to be heavily involved in geopolitics, while the Viamontian aggression against the Garun might give them cause for concern. The Shou are primarily a self-contained region. In the distant past, they have made some interactions with the expansive Rillian Empire, however. Similar to the history of Imperial China, Shou culture is characterized by dynastic changes, warring kingdoms, and spiritual movements. To be honest, as someone who once minored in Chinese history, I would love to delve deeper into the history of the Shou. However, that might be a topic for another video, as the purpose of this video is more focused on examining the contemporary conditions of Ispar, rather than delving into a comprehensive history. Part 3. Isparians on Dareth. Earlier, we briefly discussed how the portals to Dareth might have influenced the geopolitical dynamics on Ispar. I like to imagine it as reminiscent of The Leftovers, a TV show that you should watch if you haven't already. Essentially, the show's story mirrors an event similar to the biblical rapture, where 2% of the world's population suddenly vanishes without any apparent pattern to explain their disappearance. Worldviews are understandably destabilized and shaken by such an event. I envision the portals to Dareth having a similar impact on the Isparians who remain behind. They don't receive answers until curiosity gets the better of them, leading some to depart through one of the mysterious portals themselves. Thus, even though there is only a one-way flow of information between Ispar and Dareth, Dareth still exerts a profound influence on the events of Ispar. The decision of the Viamontians to halt their expansionist ambitions is a perfect example of this. Consequently, we must also consider the impact on cultures and nations that are never summoned through the portals, notably Silveran and Melantian. It's possible that these people and their nations enjoyed a certain degree of prosperity for largely staying uninvolved in the wars of their peers, but additionally for having no portals to spirit people away from their own kingdoms. Meanwhile, as Viamont ceased its expansionist ambitions and seemed to be looking toward a more insular future, the Viamontians who ventured through the portals continue on as they were. However, something worth considering is that in a globalized world, if there's a power void, it's usually filled by a newcomer, with Viamont, Alluvia, Garun, and even Rillia all involved in destructive and costly wars. Two primary factors must be taken into account regarding their potential for continued expansionism, notably the availability of resources and the opportunities to acquire those resources. In essence, they need both to sustain their war machine and to see tangible benefits ahead that would enable their war machine to continue growing. However, perhaps the most critical resource of all is the availability of manpower, whether as soldiers or as laborers supporting the war effort. I'm sure you can see where I'm going with this. With a significant number of Isparians from Viamont, Alluvia, Garun, and Shou disappearing through portals, even though those on Dareth cannot directly interact with the world they left behind, their absence still has a profound impact on Ispar. In a roundabout way, this one-way exchange of information actually does influence Ispar as a whole. Before moving on to the next part, I just want to say that I think all of this would make for a pretty interesting spin-off game centered around Ispar. Perhaps one where portals to Ispar from Dareth are the primary story mover. Part 4. Closing. To conclude, Ispar, as the world where Asheron's calls so-called main characters come from, player characters, is perhaps one of the most well-developed lore areas outside of the areas you can visit in the game. There are lots of cultures mentioned from Ispar that have never made an appearance in Asheron's Call. But that being said, if Warner Brothers ever did decide to make another Asheron's Call game, which I think it's not very likely anyway, but regardless of that, if they did, I think it would be interesting to see them take a step back and perhaps make a game that looks more at the Isparians in their own element. I know it doesn't have all these fancy medieval fantasy aliens and whatnot, but hey, it's a game. The devs would be able to make anything happen that they really wanted. But of course, to reiterate, the likelihood of all that is pretty slim. Nevertheless, I would like to see more of unvisited worlds and regions such as Ispar, and while we're on that topic, maybe perhaps we'll visit another world here on Asheron's Call lore, but that will have to be for a future video. Thank you so much for watching, guys. I know this one was a little bit different than my usual AC lore video. I won't be breaking from my regular formula, but I wanted to try something a little different for this video, and I really hope it goes over well. If you came across this video and aren't yet subscribed, please consider subscribing. It helps me out a ton. But until next time, folks, have fun and stay safe, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye-bye!